So in the Larry Merculieff video that you watched, or Ilarion Merculieff, I hope you liked that video. I found it to be a really compelling talk, where Ilarion shared his knowledge with us, and I really appreciate that. He's a really well-known Unangax author, and scholar and teacher that we've been really blessed to learn from in this state. And I want you to think as you watch that video, what do you notice, among other things, about how children were treated? So especially for those of you who are interested in sort of psychology or child development, or some of you who are interested in like social work, when you think about the ways he describes sort of kids being interacted with and the way in which each child was greeted by name in a way that sounds almost like how an adult would be greeted by name. Although, yeah, we sometimes greet kids like that too. But imagine if you walk through your town and literally every single person is like, oh, hey, Adam, how's it going? 6-year-old. That's interesting, right? That's something that I think is sometimes experienced in small groups, right? People might experience that, for example, at their church, or maybe at the workplace of their parents when they're a little kid. But as far as our like towns, when you have like a city, even a not that huge of a city like Soldotna, right? 5,000 people, it's not like my kids walk through Safeway and everybody knows their name or something. So I want you to kind of imagine that, and not just imagine that, because one could argue that that's any small town, but also the way in which kids are just, as Merculieff points out, like invited in, like, here, come get breakfast with us, come get breakfast with us, right? This way in which sort of, you've heard that phrase, it takes a village to raise a child. That is like literally true here. That's not just an expression here, right? Like, in a sense, the whole village is kind of taking the kid in and treating them like a human being, and an adult, in a way that sometimes kids aren't in other contexts. It's really kind of fascinating. Not that kids aren't treated like humans elsewhere, but in this sense, kind of treated as, I guess, fully functioning members of the society, even as a small child. It's pretty interesting. Um, the way in which learning was treated, I thought it was fascinating what he shared about his mentor, that, he's like, I learned so many things from this guy. He never said more than 50 words to me, right? So it's like, think about that and what that says about language, right? And the way in which perhaps language doesn't always have to be the main way that information is conveyed. And he talks a lot about how much he learned by sitting with other people while they were watching seabirds and while they were hunting, right? And how much you learned just observing. And so kind of trying to break our brain a little bit from this way that in Western society, we oftentimes think of words, 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 and I'm doing it right now, right? Words, words, words is the vehicle to knowledge, and kind of trying to break our brain of that and realize that that's not how things work traditionally in traditional Unangax society. Do words matter? Of course, right? And I could share with you other quotes from people that grew up in villages that are like, oh yeah, like my parents would recite the stories to me over and over. So it's not that words weren't important, but the way in which they didn't have to be important, and that you could have teaching relationships with people that had very few words involved. So I want you to think of all that, and I kind of want you to think about how that compares to what you experienced in life as a child, whatever your cultural background. And for some of you, this may sound kind of familiar, and for some of you, I suspect a lot of you, this might sound really, really different. Certainly sounds different than the way I was raised, and I think kind of fascinating, and shows us a very different way of thinking about how human beings can learn, and perhaps teaches us, maybe we sometimes undersell what kids can learn and how kids can learn. He also has something really fascinating. He talks about it in the video, and he's also talked about it elsewhere, of how do you navigate in a place like the Aleutian Islands. So traditionally, people would have been navigating between islands to trade, for marriage, sometimes for battles. People were boating around. They weren't just sticking around on their own island, and they were also just going out there to hunt, right, into the ocean. And how do you navigate? Because the Aleutian Islands has especially depending on where you're at, often very, very, very cloudy and or rainy. Good luck navigating by the stars on those days, right? Which has been traditionally one of the main ways people navigated prior to compass and map. And you didn't really have a classic compass or paper map, so what do you do? And as I really like this quote from him, he says, our people could navigate without the stars, a feat that requires tuning into and merging with the spirit that lives in all things. The real human being is able to navigate by feeling the energy of the sea and land, watching the direction of swells in the sea and the kind of birds and seals that come through the fog, knowing the directions of tidal movements, feeling the rhythm of the water, listening to animals on the rookeries and cliff, intuition, gut feel, heart sense. I like that quote for so many different reasons. I've been sharing it for several years, and I always find something new each time I read it. And one of the things that's striking me at this time with reading it is how many different small kinds of environmental cues you would have to be cued into to navigate through a foggy environment. An environment that often you could get capsized in really easily or end up on the rocks. The other thing that really strikes me, though, is how this quote kind of blends things that I hate the abstraction of Western culture, because Western culture, much like Alaska Native culture, is many smaller cultures. But in any case, sometimes in kind of Western European informed post-Enlightenment cultures, you have this kind of division of science and religion, right? But I like this kind of way in which the physical world and kind of this idea of like tuning into spiritual things are kind of very much blended in this quote. There's not that like easy binary split between the two, where here's where the spiritual stuff goes, here's where the physical stuff goes. Here, that's very much blended as he's describing sort of how you make it through the sea on a cloudy day without capsizing yourself. I really like that quote. Traditionally, Unangax people lived in Ula, which are traditional Aleut homes, what Russians came to call barabaras, just like they came to call kayaks or yak. They came to call those badarkas. But in any case, the Ula would, or barabaras would be these like large sod structures. These aren't entirely dissimilar from the Nichil that we talked about with in Dena'ina land a couple of lectures ago, but some important differences here, one of which is that people would often enter like through the top of the structure rather than through the side of the structure. And it's kind of almost built into the land, which provides a really good way, of course, to regulate your temperature in a place like the Aleutian Islands. So really just, you're going to get tired of me saying that certain types of cultural practices are genius, but this one is genius. It's a really, really smart way of regulating the temperature and making sure that you get through the winter fine, but also through the summer fine, right? So if you dig it partially into the ground, you're regulating on both sides your temperature extremes. And it is worth noting that in the 60s and 70s, when people started really getting into this idea in the United States of like environmentally sustainable housing, people started to getting into this idea of sort of building into the land or with like plants on top of your building and stuff. But it's like, oh, this has already been being done for thousands and thousands of years on the Aleutian Islands by Unangax people. And was done well into the early 20th century, as you can see here. Although nowadays, if you go to villages in the Aleutian Islands, people are not in Ula. I hope that's obvious in context, right? People are living in frame houses like anybody else in the United States in the 21st century. I'm going to stop the video here because then we kind of go in a very different direction.